like to just tell you a little short story before we start. One of my favorite pastors of all time was HMS Richards. I grew up listening to him, and he was a friend of our family. The thing I liked about Elder Richards was every sermon was about Jesus. There wasn't one single sermon that he ever preached that Jesus wasn't at the very center of it. The last time I believe that he ever came to Oregon camp meeting in Gladstone, I was there and sitting in about the third row, and he was preaching again about Jesus. And the thing I noticed was that he couldn't see very well. His glasses were like Coke bottles, the end of the Coke bottle. And one time they said people were sitting on the platform, I can't remember who it was, and they said that when he was reading the Bible, he actually had it upside down. And he was reading, he had the whole New Testament memorized almost word for word. And when he was reading, he didn't want to make people think and brag, that he could quote everything. So he acted like he was reading it, but it was actually, he got it upside down. I really respected him for his knowledge of the Bible. So anyway, this one day, the crowd, there's like 30,000 people there at Gladstone, and it was hot, and the tent was full of people. And after the sermon, everybody crowded up there on the stage to try to talk to him. By this time, he was pretty old and getting a little bit frail. It was actually his last time, I believe, he ever came to the camp meeting. So I went up there and I said, I just want him to sign my Bible because I have an HMS Richards study Bible, and I would really like to have him sign that. So I stood, and there were about 30 people ahead of me. And finally, his wife was standing beside him, and she was pretty protective of him. Probably felt that it was her duty to keep him going and help him strong. People were getting in line for lunch. And finally, there was only one other person, and me. I was going to be next. And just as soon as he got done talking with that other person, his wife grabbed him by the arm and was whisking him away. And I forgot what her name was, Hazel or whatever. And he said, just a minute. He says, just hold everything. He came over and he put his arm on my shoulder and he says, how are you today? And it just like there was no one else in the world to talk to. And I told him my name, and he says, Fleck, yeah, I remember that. I remember when the Voice of Prophecy Quartet in Del Delco, we went out to your grandma and grandpa's house in Longview on the farm, and we had a big farm dinner out there, and the quartet sang to your grandparents. You remember that? I said, no, I wasn't there. But anyway, so I said, would you mind? And his wife was pulling on his arm, trying to get him away to go to lunch or whatever. And I said, I just have a favor to ask. Would you mind signing my Bible? And he says, sure. So I opened my Bible, and I'll let you look at it afterward, but there's his signature right there. HMS Richards, 1 Corinthians 2, 1 and 2. And I always remember that he said that all he wants to preach was about Jesus. And so that's why I chose this morning also, because this was one of the mottos of the Waldenses. And we'll talk a little bit more about that as we go through. This afternoon we'll get to see this film, the first half. And so this talk this morning is kind of giving you a little bit of heads up about the Waldenses. Is there anyone here that's never heard of the Waldenses before? Okay, we got 2 people, 3. Okay. And I found that a lot of Seventh-day Adventists that have been in the church for a long time don't know very much about them either. I've always been very interested in the Waldenses ever since I was a young boy. And actually the book Great Controversy, chapter 4, is all about the Waldenses. And you might want to read that when you get home tonight. It doesn't take very long. And it's just kind of a summary. She took a lot of that material from books that she read by D'Aubigné and Wiley, The History of Protestantism. And the Adventist Church published the chapter 16 in the Wiley's book, History of Protestantism, which is all about the Waldenses. So you can actually go to the ABC and you can get The Waldenses by Wiley, and it's chapter 16 of his 3-volume book. And so the Waldenses have always fascinated me, and there was one person in particular that I have always really admired in our church, one of our pioneers, and his name was Benjamin George Wilkinson. And he wrote Truth Triumphant, and he wrote our authorized version, Vindicated. And he was a very prominent leader in our Adventist church. He was the head of theology at Washington Missionary College. He'd been a missionary himself. He spoke like 6 different languages. He traveled around all over the world, and he tried to show, and successfully did, that all during the Dark Ages, there have always been, ever since the apostles, there have always been people in different countries, China, India, and all over the world that have kept the Sabbath and that have believed in the second coming, just like we do. And that's what Truth Triumphant is all about. I would recommend that if you could find that book or a reprint, you can get it from Layman's Ministries. Jeff Rich has it in Idaho. And you get a reprint of it. And so that, I've always really admired him. Recently got a document that was done by his granddaughter at Andrews University. It's a story of his life, 16 pages. And they pulled it out of the archives. It was published in 1970 something. And so he was a very interesting person. And there was another young man that was a big fan of mine. I mean, I was a fan of his. And that was Jim Arabito. And Jim Arabito, he 2 books that he loved, besides the Bible, of course. Truth Triumphant by Wilkinson and The Great Controversy. And he had a backpack, and he took his backpack over to Europe and all around the world. And if you've ever seen the history of the Alps, Israel of the Alps, he has his backpack, and he has his Great Controversy, and he has his Truth Triumphant in the Bible. And he went all over Europe and took pictures of all the places that Benjamin George Wilkinson mentioned in his book to show that there have always been faithful people all along. It wasn't just when Rachel Preston came on the scene, in the 1800s and brought our attention back to the Sabbath with Joseph Bates and so forth, that people all over the world were keeping the Sabbath, even in Africa. In fact, the first slaves that came to the United States were Sabbath keepers that were being punished by the papacy because they wouldn't accept Jesuit missionaries. So they made them into slaves and brought them over to Cuba and Haiti and the United States. Very interesting history. So a lot of people have been keeping the Sabbath and worshiping like we do all through the... So anyway, tragically, Jim Arabito was up in Alaska filming about Sabbath keeping in Alaska. And on the way back in a private plane, he was not flying. He was a passenger. And I believe 1 or 2 of his kids were with him. And the plane crashed and he was killed. And his wife, Pat Arabito, has continued to publish some different things. And you can still get all of Jim Arabito's DVDs now. I have all of them, I think. And they're really worth watching because he was right on target with the last days, current events that in his time were even more current in our time. So with that introduction, I'd like to just start with a little bit about the Waldenses. And I see my friend Mike Avaylon just came in, and I'm going to ask him in a little bit to come up and share some of this because he actually been studying the Waldenses ever since he was a little boy too. Did you bring the book with you? Okay. He has a little book, and he'll tell you about the story of this little book. But we both have shared a love of the Waldenses, and Hector Torres shared a love of the Waldenses. And somehow the Lord connected the 3 of us, and the next thing we knew, we were on a plane to Italy to film one of the first documentaries where we tried to show that they kept the Sabbath and that they went all the way back to the apostles. 2 big lies that have been told by the Catholic Church against them and against us is that no, they didn't go back to it. And so anyway, so we were over there and we had a wonderful time. The weather was just like today. It was blue skies the whole time. About in the 70s. It was perfect for filming. And so it was a wonderful experience. So their motto was, a light shines in darkness. If I turn this on, I think it will work better. So the Waldenses, I'm sorry if I'm in your way here, they are among our spiritual forefathers. A lot of people don't realize this. They constitute the link between the early Christian church and the churches of the Protestant Reformation of the 15th and 16th centuries. They were the seed of the woman, the church in the wilderness, that fled the wrath of the dragon during 1,260 years. Remember, the 1,260 years started when? Until when? What happened in 1798? Pope was taken prisoner. And the general, does anyone remember what happened to him? About 2 years later, committed suicide. Just a little tidbit of historical information. So the Waldenses, who are they? Well, they're a prophetic people with a wonderful history. I'm sorry if I'm in your way here. The original Waldenses, some of them still live in the Alps. And if you look at Italy, let's say that Italy is right here. The Alps between Italy and France are called the Cottian Alps, after King Kotia. And then the Alps come all the way over here, Switzerland and Austria like this, so it's like a U. And they're right down in here, and you'll see in a map in a minute. Most of them have lost their vision, and they don't realize that their heritage. In fact, they have just 2 years ago joined the Methodist Church and the Catholic Church now. And they're called the Waldo Methodist Church. So it's a really sad, the priests are now doing marriages in the Waldensian churches. They're getting married in the Catholic churches. And it's just a sad thing they finally gave up after many hundreds of years of persecution. Most of them believe the papal myth that they date only back to Peter Waldo in the 12th century. The papacy tried to show that the Waldenses did not date back to the apostles and that the papacy dates all the way back to Peter. So they didn't like it when they found a group of people that said, no, we came back from the apostles. We're keeping the Sabbath. We believe in the Bible. And they didn't believe in the corrupt Bible, Jerome's Vulgate version that the church put out. And so they were persecuted fiercely for many, many years, hundreds of years. Peter Waldo was and we'll explain a little bit more about this afternoon. Peter Waldo was actually a very wonderful Christian man that believed the same, many like we do, that we're saved by faith and not by works. And he was very wealthy, and he went to the Pope, and he says, I'd like to, he was a Catholic, but he says, I would like to preach the gospel, the true gospel. And the Pope said, no, you may not do that. I will not give you permission to do that. He was a wealthy merchant, but he wanted to preach. And so the Pope says, no. He says, the only thing you can preach is the doctrines of our Catholic Church. And you know what Peter Waldo told the Pope? He said, that's interesting because Peter, who you say was the first Pope, said we should obey God rather than man. So eventually he was kicked out. He actually fled for his life out of France. And he went over and he joined the Waldenses that were already there. They'd been there for hundreds of years. And so there's confusion about the name Waldenses. It did not come from Peter Waldo, as we'll see in a little bit. But here he is. This is in the monument in Worms, Germany. And it's only a side monument because the main one, it would be Martin Luther, right, in Worms. And on the side is Peter Waldo sitting here. And there's something very interesting. You see his shoes here? They actually pulled up his robe a little bit so you could see his shoe. That means he was a Sabbath keeper, seventh-day Sabbath keeper, because of the way his shoes are laced. You know, when people put a fish on the back bumper of their car, a sticker, they're a Christian. When you wore when you wore your shoes laced a certain way back then, that meant you were a Sabbath keeper, Seventh-day Sabbath keeper. This is a fact that we learned from a Waldensian pastor over there who you're going to meet in our film. But it's very interesting. So the papacy did everything they could to destroy all the records of the Waldenses. They hated them with a passion. They hated them because they kept the Sabbath. They hated them because they had their own Bible. There was a purist, Ellen White said it was a purist manuscript, the first people in Europe to have the Bible in their own language. And they hated that because it exposed all the errors of the church. Fortunately, many critically important documents were taken to England and preserved in the library of Thomas Bodley at Oxford University in England, and also at Cambridge University Library. Here we see photos of the famous Bodleian Library, where these records have been safely stored for hundreds of years. When I was in Oxford, I was so excited. I was ignorant, naive, and I thought, I'm just going to go to the Bodleian Library and I'm going to find some of these writings. Well, I walked all over town. I finally found it, and it was closed for a month for restoration. And then I found out later that I couldn't get in anyway because the only people that have access to those Waldensian records are faculty members or students that are doing research with permission. But I was naive, and at least I got to see from the outside. It's a pretty awesome place. Oxford has 38 colleges, 6 permanent private halls of religious foundation. Many of the 38 colleges have sister colleges at Cambridge. Look at this library. I mean, this is incredible. Here it is inside. I know Mike and a few other of you people are bibliophiles. That means you love books. I would like to spend the rest of my life just going in there with a ladder and trying to find books in English or Spanish that I could read. I mean, this is just a mouth-watering place to go if you love books. I mean, all the top books from the world. People sent books from all over the world to try to keep them safe there. So fortunately, they have a lot of original documents of the Waldenses that are not released to anybody. They're secretly kept there because of it, and you'll find out in the film why. So it was named after Thomas Bodley. Initially, it only had about 2,000 books, and now it has 12 million books. It's one of the most famous libraries in the world. There was a man named Rainerius Sacco, and he was a former Waldensian pastor who apostatized, and he sort of reminds me of Canwright. Anybody hear of Canwright? He was a leader in our Adventist church, and he was actually on the General Conference Committee for 2.5 years. Very prominent preacher, but he had a problem, and it's a disease. Some doctors get this disease, and it's a really bad disease. It's almost fatal disease. It's called big shotism. And he got this disease, and he wanted to be a big shot. He wanted to be like Billy Graham, or of course Billy Graham wasn't then, but be like Billy Sunday, Charles Spurgeon. He wanted to be a famous. He said, if I just had a more popular message, I could be a more popular evangelist. And so after several years, many years in the Adventist church, writing really good things about our doctrines, defending our faith, he left and wrote a terrible book against us. And now this book is being used in all the seminaries by the Protestants in the United States to condemn Seventh-day Adventists. But fortunately, there was a man named Elder Branson. I think he was the president of the General Conference. And he wrote a book that completely debunked every single thing that he said. And it's called In Defense of the Faith. I would advise everybody to try to find that book. You can go online and get it. You can get a reprint of it. It's called In Defense of the Faith. And it completely debunks everything. But unfortunately, the seminaries, these Protestant seminaries, they don't read that book, of course. Anyway, so this Waldensian pastor apostatized, and he actually became a papal persecutor. And he became an officer of the Inquisition that was killing the Protestants. So he was a turncoat. He was like Balaam in the Bible, you know. He started off good and ended up terrible. And that's what happened. And he said, he wrote a book, and he said that there were 3 reasons why they were so dangerous, the Waldenses. And the main reason was because they were the oldest sect. And they dated clear back, maybe even from the time, they're the oldest, of all the ancient sects, maybe even to the time of Pope Sylvester. And he died in 335. So one of the inquisitors, a Catholic inquisitor, even said that the Waldenses went clear back into the 4th century. I mean, this is amazing. And we'll show you some more stuff in our fourth section of the last section of our film, which will be next month. So many people actually tried to attack the Waldenses theologically and physically even. They desperately tried to date the rise of the Waldenses from Peter Waldo. But there are several early Waldensian heroes or evangelical leaders that kept continental Europe true to primitive Christianity between the days of the Apostles and the Albigensian Crusades. These believers did not separate from the papacy, for they had never belonged to it. How can you separate from it if you never belonged to it in the first place? They were preaching the truth. They were like part of the remnant church. God has always had a remnant church, right? In the Old Testament, there was a remnant Israel. In the New Testament, there was a remnant people. And in the last, there's going to be a remnant of the remnant. Is that right? So, Vigilantius Leo was one of the early Waldensian pioneers. Not Peter Waldo. But Vigilantius Leo, that's why they're called Leonists. Not because they came from Lyon, France, with Peter Waldo. You see how Satan has just taken a little bit, and he's taken, Peter Waldo came from Lyons, it's pronounced Leo, France. And Vigilantius Leo, that's his real name, they called the Waldenses Leonists because they followed Leo. Not because of Peter Waldo that came from Lyon, France. Does that make any sense? But see how close Satan can deceive people. And so you have to be careful when you're reading history, what kind of lenses you're looking at. There's 3 types of ways of looking at history. You can look at it through Protestant lens, through Catholic lens, or through secular lens. And every history book is going to be through one of those 3 lenses. So you just have to be careful when you read the history books. So anyway, he preached on both sides of the Alps, both in Italy and France. It was a thundering denunciation of Jerome, the great champion of the papacy who wrote Jerome's Latin Vulgate. He was paid a lot of money by the Pope to write this. The Pope said it was perfect book, perfect Bible, and Jerome found hundreds of mistakes in it, and he revised it, umpteen times, but the first one was perfect. And so Jerome was really upset with Vigilantius Leo. And he said, the wretch's tongue should be cut out, or he should be put under treatment for insanity, because he was preaching the truth. People welcomed Vigilantius with open arms, and his preaching was powerful. He denounced the church celibacy, worship of relics, lighted candles, all-night vigils, prayers to the dead. He spent his inherited fortune in collecting manuscripts, circulating the scripture, employing secretaries to write from dictation or to copy manuscripts and to write pamphlets, tracts. He was an incredible missionary. He was one of the first Waldensian leaders that we know about. He has been called the forerunner of the Reformation, one of the earliest of our Protestant forefathers. The Waldenses, their preaching and leadership burned its way across the centuries until it united with the heroic reforms of Luther. Claude was a Spaniard, and he was a famous apostle of the true Christian church in the 9th century in northern Italy. He became Bishop of Turin. He boldly defied the papacy and called the people back to the New Testament faith and practice. In France, the people who believed like the Waldenses were called Albigenses and Huguenots. Some people argue that the Huguenots are not true Christians. I have a whole bunch of books, probably 6 or 8 books in the 18th century, 19th century, that prove that they were Christians. But all God's people have been called all kinds of bad names, children of the devil and everything, and they've maligned the Huguenots, and that's a whole nother subject. But it's very interesting that God had true people in France and also in Italy at the same time that were preaching the truth. So here's a map of Italy, and you can see Rome is clear down here, but we're going to be clear up here. So here's Torre Pellice, right there. You can't hardly see it, but that's Torre Pellice. There's Turin or Torino. This whole area, back in historical times, was in the Dukes of Savoy ruled there. It was a kingdom. The Dukes of Savoy was a kingdom. So the Waldenses were being persecuted by the Dukes of Savoy, who were Catholics. They were persecuted by the Italian government and by the French government. And as you'll see in the film, Louis XIV, who was the King of France, his nephew was one of the Dukes of Savoy. And when he revoked the Edict of Nantes, which was a big deal, the Edict of Nantes way back gave the Protestants freedom. They could go to church, they could preach, they could become doctors or lawyers, they could be teachers, they had rights. But when Louis XIV was just about ready to die, he called in his Jesuit confessor and he said, I've been a bad person, man. There was a big massacre of Protestants over here, and I feel I killed a whole bunch of innocent people, and what can I do to be saved? I'm a sinful man. What can I do to make up for my sinful life? And the priest says, well, let me think about it, and I'll pray about it. And the next day he came back and he says, okay, I know what you can do. I was shown that if you want to be saved in heaven, all you have to do is do away with that Freedom Act for the Protestants, and then you will go to heaven. And so he did that. It's called the revocation of the Edict of Nantes. Nantes is a place in northwestern France where the edict was made, like 73 years before or something. And so what happened, instantly just massacred thousands and thousands of people, butchered all over France. Just terrible. Then Louis wrote to his, they didn't have cell phones, they didn't have fax machines or emails, but he sent a message to his nephew, the Duke of Savoy, and he says, I want you to exterminate all those Waldenses over there, like we did over here. We tried to kill all the Huguenots, and we tried to kill all the Albigenses. Now he said, you need to do that. Well, the problem was that the Duke, his wife was a Christian, Protestant, and she tried to protect them, but she didn't have enough power to do it. And so finally, Louis sent him another message, and he says, if you don't do it, I'll come and do it for you. He says, we'll send an army of 10 or 20,000, and we'll come and butcher them ourselves if you're not willing to do it. So at that point, I'm kind of getting ahead of the story. You'll see this in the film. But you see that they were just terribly persecuted. So this whole area they were being persecuted in 3 different places. Does that remind you of anything of what might happen to us in the last days? We're going to be persecuted by the papacy. We're going to be persecuted by the U.S. government. And we're going to be persecuted by the Protestants. Exactly. I mean, it's you're going to get it from all different angles, just like they did. It's amazing the corollaries between the Waldenses and what it's going to be for us in the last days. The Waldenses valleys are pretty cool because they're just big mountains and they have valleys, and the valleys come together like spokes. So the spokes come in like this, and the mountains are all around, and each valley has a different name. But there's 3 main valleys. There's 4 minor valleys, but there's 3 main ones. And today in the film, you're going to get to see what the main one. It's going to be really exciting when you see this. The first of the 3 valleys that are important is the Lucerna Valley, and that's called the Valley of Light. And this is where Torre Pellice is, and that's the headquarters of the Waldenses then and today. That's where we stayed, and that's where we did our filming from. And the Aurora Valley, which is the Valley of Dews, because of the dews is like tears, the dew that comes up the grass, well, the tears, the Valley of Tears. And Grogna Valley, where you're going to go this afternoon in the film, that's called the Valley of Groans. That's what it means in English. And Grogna means the Valley of Groans, moaning and groaning and tears. The last 4 valleys form the rim of the wheel. All are enclosed by a line of lofty mountains. And the Pra Valley is the most famous of all these. Each valley is a fortress having its own gate in and gate out, caves, rocks, mighty chestnut trees, all forming places of retreat and shelter, so the highest engineering skill could not have a better adapted each valley to this purpose. Isn't there a promise where it says that the munitions of rocks. God is going to hide us in the pavilion, remember? Some of those promises. This is exactly what happened. God protected his people and put them in this fortress up here in the valleys. So this is just a picture. I don't want to take away from the film, but just to whet your appetite a little bit. This is from what you're going to see. This is Torre Pellice, and this is the headquarters then and now. And up here, you see this little mountain? That's called Castelluso, and that's where they, in the Great Controversy, it says they threw them off the cliffs. That's where that happened. This is the Adventist headquarters, and there's 3 floors. The bottom floor is the church, which is right, here's the front of the church. It says the meetings, Sabbath school at 10 o'clock, and worship service, divine worship service at 10:30 on Sabbath. The Christian church, Seventh-day Adventists. So this is the inside, and I had the privilege about 5 years ago of preaching in that church, and there were 3 Waldensian ladies, the first time any Waldenses had been come into that church. And we taught some classes on health. You know, health ministry is where it's all at, as far as getting people interested in helping people. That's the medical missionary work. And afterward, they came up and they said, Dr. Fleck, could you move to Torre Pellice? We want to have you here. I don't think they wanted the theology. They wanted the medical part, you know. But it's really neat that those people, they didn't used to be open to Adventists. But 2 things happened that's changed their mind a little bit. First thing is the New England Youth Ensemble went over there and played in the main headquarters building, the Synod, the General Conference building of the Waldenses. And when they heard that beautiful music, they said, wow, these Adventists are not a bunch of fly-by-night weirdos. This is really good music. And then the men's chorus, about 100 and some Romanian men came over in their choir and sang there. They're beautiful. They came to Walla Walla. I don't know if you've ever heard them, but they're just awesome. And after those 2 events, now they think Adventists are okay, to a certain degree. When we were there, they were having a fair in Torre Pellice, and we went down and asked them if we could have permission to have a little booth where we could check blood pressures. And they went and talked to the leaders, and they came back and they said, no, it's not possible. So they wouldn't even let us take blood pressures. That's where it's, the only way you can get in is house to house, one-on-one medical evangelism. So this is looking down where they used to throw them off the cliff, looking down the valley. Here's a church, Waldensian church. This is inside of a Waldensian church. And it says, we preach Christ and Him crucified. And it says, for the preaching of the cross is foolishness, except to those that believe. That's in 1 Corinthians 1, 18 and 23. And this is in all their churches. This is on the front of every church. That's their motto. 1 Corinthians 1, 18 and 23. Those are their mottos. Ellen White made 3 visits over there. She was shown in vision many things about him, but she went over there 3 times. And this is documented in the book, Historical Sketches of the Foreign Missions of Seventh-day Adventists. I lent that book to somebody that I trusted, and I haven't seen it since. I don't even remember who it was. I'm really hoping that someday they will remember and send it back to me. It's very hard to find. You can get a reprint of it, but to find an original one in 1800s. So 3 times she went over there, and she wanted to preach to them, and she rented a hall, but there was a pastor of a different church that hated Adventists, and he followed her all over Europe, and he tried to ruin her influence. And so he followed her there to Torre Pellice, and for the first 3 days she was there, she was holding meetings downstairs, and he rented the hall upstairs, and he hired some ruffians, 10 or 20 rough young men from the town, and he paid them, and they would stomp on the floor, and it would deafen the noise to where they couldn't even hear her speaking down below. And somebody said to her, you need to shut this guy down. And she said, no, he has a soul to save. And after 3 days, he gave up and left. But she said in the last days there's going to be some miracles happen, and we'll show that in a minute. The Angrogna Valley is the most famous of these three main valleys. It's located just to the east of the little village. And this is the place where you go up to the College of the Barbs, the College of the Pastors. They call the pastors barbs. That means uncles. Because if they called him a pastor, they would kill him right away. Everybody's an uncle. Like we call Uncle John or Uncle Bob or whatever. They didn't want to identify, so the kids and everybody called their pastors uncles, barbs, B-A-R-B-E. And the average lifespan was about 2 years. They would all be killed. And that'll be in the film. You'll see that too. So we're going to see that on the film, I believe, today. And this is going up in the Valley of the Groans, okay, on Grogna Valley. And this is the College of the Barbs. Inside they have this is not an old Bible, but it just shows that how they used it. Their only textbook for 3 years was the Bible. Can you imagine what would happen in our seminaries and in our colleges and universities if we only taught the Bible, but we didn't have all these other books? I mean, wouldn't that be amazing? Now, one other thing they did do, they taught them all kinds of languages. They became very fluent in languages from all over the world. And in fact, one of their Waldenses very early on went to England. His name was Lollardo. And his followers were called Lollards. And when Wycliffe came along, he died in 1283 or something, so in the 13th century. When he came along, he was called the Morning Star of the Reformation. But that's wrong because Lollard was over there before that. And his followers were called Lollards. And so the Catholics hated them. And so they said the word Lollard means murmurers because only the priest can preach. These guys are muttering. And so the Lollard means muttering. No, Lollards means they were preaching the truth because Lollard went over from Italy as a Waldensian and taught them. And actually Wycliffe got some of his doctrines from the Waldenses. Isn't that cool? I mean, when I found this out, it gave me chills to realize that they were even over in England. They went to Africa. They went all over. There are pictures in the museum of Waldenses in Africa in canoes giving the gospel. They went all over the world. This is the cave that we're going to go in our film, where they went in and had worship and they hid in there. They did an experiment recently, and they said, the guide says, we're going to walk down this trail and see if you can find the cave. The whole group walked past the cave, not one person identified it. Then he went back and said, there it is. And we're going to actually go in the cave, and you're going to get to see that. And we had to get on our hands and knees and crawl in. Some people had claustrophobia, 1 or 2 people. Sissies, they had to wait outside. But once you actually get in, it's not, you can stand up, but it's just that first little bit where you're crawling down. Maria actually went in, I was proud of her, but some people, they don't have enough courage to go in there because it's so tight. You get in there, it's like a cathedral. And there's light coming in through the cracks in the rocks. And one of the Waldensian guides one time after everybody left, he said that there's like 80-some South Koreans on a tour. And Danielle, that supports our ministry over there, she took the rest of them up to some more sites. And he said, would you like me to show you some cool stuff after just the 2 of us? And I said, yeah. He said, let me explain something about this cave. And I've been in that cave 3 times. I never heard this before. He said, this cave is like, these caves are like cheese. He said, I can go in here and I can go 7 miles and come out on the other side of the mountain, right through that crack right there. And over here we can go over another way. The people didn't know that, and that's how they were able to escape. These are natural caves. They aren't man-made. Tunnels that God has put there so they could escape. It's like cheese, it's got holes all through the cheese. That's the way these caves are, but most people go in there and they see the cave. Oh, they don't realize that they could escape and go all different directions. This is one of the first Waldensian churches that was ever built, still standing. And you can see that pretty simple. They don't have gold and images and idols and all kinds of decorations. It's just a simple meeting place. In 2017, there was something incredible that happened. Incidentally, read Character and Aims of the Papacy. That's in chapter 35 of Great Controversy. That's a really good chapter to read, and you'll see exactly some of the fulfillment of the things that we're going to watch today. Francis was the first pope to visit a Waldensian church. He went to Turin, and he told the worship, and first, for them it's a corruption. To step into a Waldensian church is like going into a hellhole, because they consider them just worse than garbage. But he actually went in there. He's ecumenical. He's trying to win them back. He succeeded in winning them back. It says he went in and he says, reflecting on the history of our relations, we can only grieve in the face of strife and violence committed in the name of faith and ask, Lord, to give us the grace to recognize we are all sinners and to know how to forgive one another. He then embraced the Waldensian leader, Eugenio Bernardini, and said, I ask forgiveness for the non-Christian, even inhuman attitudes and behaviors, which through history we have had against you. In Jesus Christ's name, forgive us. On behalf of the Catholic Church, I ask for your forgiveness. I asked one of the Waldensian pastors over there, what did you think about that? He says, what if you took the Indian chief from Custer's Last Stand and you told his followers now today, the Indians, please forgive us for what we butchered you there at Custer's Last Stand. What is that? How can you forgive something that happened hundreds of years ago, a long time ago? He says you can't do it. How can somebody forgive for some terrible atrocity that happened? And that was his answer to me. So he cited the scriptures which speak of different gifts of the Spirit. He said that wars often break out when people do not accept these differences of others. He thanked God that the relationship between the Catholics and Waldenses continues today to be even more rooted in the mutual respect and fraternal charity. Then they did something really incredible. The Waldensian leader gave him a replica of the Waldensian Bible. This is a Bible that was translated into French. And guess who the editor of it was? In the preface, he gave the opening remarks in the Bible. John Calvin, the arch heretic of the Catholic Church. In Rome, in the Jesuit Church of Jesus, there's a picture on the wall of an angel with her foot on actually I think it's Mary with her foot on Calvin's head. And yet, he accepted this Bible, and then he did something incredible. He kissed the Bible, and there are some very, very upset Catholics about this. Very upset. And I said, don't worry, because probably when he went out in the street, he spit in the gutter. But it was a show, and it worked. Because now they've all joined back, the Methodist Church, and back to the Catholic Church. They forgot all their history. I mean, I don't blame them because they just went through so much heartache, but they've finally given in. And in spite of all this, there were 3 bulls about exterminating all the Waldenses. Rome never changes. The Rome Church, this is from Great Controversy 571. The Roman Church now presents a fair front. A what? A front to the world, covering with apologies her record of horrible cruelty. Can you read? This was written in 1888. And then you saw that picture of him kissing the Bible and apologizing? Is that an answer to prophecy, fulfillment? She has clothed herself in Christ-like garments, but she is unchanged. Every principle of the papacy that existed in past ages exists today. The doctrines devised in the darkest ages are still held. Let none deceive themselves. The papacy that Protestants are now so ready to honor is the same that ruled the world in the days of the Reformation, when men of God stood up at the peril of their lives to expose their iniquity. You'd be surprised when we travel around how many Adventists really think that Pope Francis is He's he's going to help solve all the problems in the world. And the film just came out, 2 weeks ago, A Man of His Word, all the theaters across America. I mean, this is amazing. In the movements now in progress in the United States to secure for the institutions and usages of the church the support of the state, Protestants are following in the footsteps of papists, Nay, more, they are opening the door of the papacy to regain in Protestant America the supremacy which she has lost in the old world. And let it be remembered, it is the boast of Rome that she never changes. The principles of Gregory VII and Innocent III are still the principles of the Roman Catholic Church, and had she but the power, she would put them in practice with as much vigor now as in past centuries. Rome is aiming to reestablish her power to recover her lost supremacy. Testimonies, Volume 5, says, it would be well for all our workers to study the history of the Waldensian missionaries and to imitate their example of sacrifice and self-denial. They were brave and not afraid to stand for what they believed. They lived up to all the light they had shining on them. They based all their beliefs on the true Scripture, not on corrupted versions of Scripture which also are available to them. Many of them kept the Sabbath day. They were looking for the second coming of Jesus. The cause of God needs teachers who have high moral qualities and can be trusted with the education of others. Mike, could you just come up and share with your... I want you to see this little book that he has, and also he's the one that produced this film. They put in the bulletin, it's Ron Fleck's film. And I apologize, I did not tell him to do that. It was a mistake.
It's all right.
Here, grab it. There should be a mic.
I can just do it elementary, but when I was a little boy, my parents would read to me before going to bed. And I would have stories about Bible history and then secular history and then Protestant history. I mean, my mom did a good job. And one of the books that she would read to me was the history of the Waldenses, a little children's book. Anyways, thought it was a great story, loved it, and colored in it, like most little kids do, messing things up. And anyways, years later, I wandered from my best friend, Christ, and when I was in my middle 20s, the Lord was tapping on my shoulder. And I started thinking back. And I realized that something about those Waldenses that my mind went back to. And so I started thinking about it more and more and started saying, if there are Christians that lived and stood for truth even though the heavens fell all around them, if you know what I mean by that, I want to be a Seventh-day Adventist like that. Instead of being part of the problem, I asked God that He would help me to be part of the solution to the problem and to stand for truth, to stand no matter what happens. If you're persecuted, whatever happens, it doesn't matter, because if you preach the truth, Christ and Him crucified, and you tell the truth about everything, you can sleep at night. And even if people say things that are not true about you, or they try to malign you, or they try to persecute you or whatever, or kill you or whatever, it doesn't matter, because truth will stand on its own 2 feet. So anyway, so I started thinking about that. I went and grabbed my great controversy. Now it's interesting. When I left the Lord, I didn't leave the Lord. I was actually angry, and I said, if we're going to be hypocrites, let's do it good. And so it's interesting, in the back of my Mustang, I had a 69 Mustang. In the back of my Mustang, I had the conflict series that someone gave me when I was in high school. And I carried that book in my trunk wherever I would go. I don't care if it was parties, I don't care what it was. Those books were in my trunk. And I always had them with me, and I didn't have a problem with Ellen White, by the way. Never did. And I just loved those books, and I hung on to them. Well, those are the books I went and hit. I found that great controversy, and I grabbed it, and I started researching, and I started reading, and I started reading, and started researching. And I started thinking, if I could only have that little book that my mom read to me when I was a little boy. But, time passes. That was years and years ago. That Christmas, I went to my mom's house for Christmas, as we're supposed to do, right? And a gift she gave me was this little book.
The actual
There it
one.
was. The actual book. And I can show you. Let's see here. And then she wrote it and dedicated it to me. I mean, it was amazing. How did she know? Anyways, I started coloring, and making a mess out of it. But this book means so much to me because it was the springboard that set me off on a journey that, it's amazing. I mean, I started praying as a few years ago. I said, Lord, I need to go back to the Waldensian valleys. And I thought I had it worked out. It fell apart. I tried again. It fell apart. And it's like, I just felt impressed. The Lord is going to do something someday, and I'm going to be able to go there. So I just left it with the Lord, and I was doing some meetings down in Walla Walla, and Dr. Ron happened to be down there. Now, Pastor Ron, I heard a lot about his father when I heard him preach. I never got to meet the guy. But here all of a sudden, I'm doing meetings down there, and I meet Dr. Ron Fleck. And I was like, wow, there he is. And so we sat down and started talking. Hector, Pastor Torres, was there with us, and we all started talking together, and we found ourselves on our way to Italy very quickly. I mean, within a month and a half or something like that, we were on our way. Yeah. And the Lord just put the thing into motion. If it would have been any other way, it wouldn't have worked. Any other year wouldn't have worked. This year was absolutely perfect. The weather, it was a drought. They're having a drought, but droughts are great for filming. And God knew that. So God says, okay, the drought's going to be this year, so now we're going to put this whole thing together, and God you can see how he orchestrates.
There's one other interesting thing that this was October 31 was the 500th anniversary of
That's
the
another thing.
Protestant Reformation, which the Catholic Church was doing away with the Reformation. They call it the Deformation. So we were there. One of the reasons we wanted to hurry up is because some of these historical sites we believe are going to be closed to the public, because they're trying to do away with all the memory of the Reformation, the deformation of the church. And as Ken Copeland said, it was the demon was thrown down. The demon of division was thrown down when they did away with the Reformation. So that was the timing.
The timing was absolutely perfect. So anyways, we filmed this thing. I just want to tell you, friends, when you see this film, we didn't have any script. We didn't have any teleprompter. Everything was just letting the Holy Spirit give him room to speak through us. And editing this thing was amazing how it all fell together, even though my eyes are practically, Glenn, you know what it's like when you edit. It's a lot of work, friends. I mean, you have no idea the work that goes into editing programs and films like this. But anyways, Pastor Ron, he's here. It's a lot of work. And anyways, God gets all the glory.
Amen.
I told the Lord, I said, Lord, you help me get this thing done, because this is a dream of a lifetime. And I said, you help me get this done, you get all the glory. I tell you, because we know that the third angel's message, I've said this before in some places, but it's the truth. The third angel's message is very interesting. You know what it is? Putting the glory of man in the dust. So if anything good happens, it's because God is the one that's doing it through us, because he wants to work through us to do his will. And so I hope that you come to the film and see it, and it's been such a blessing.
When we showed the film down in the Milton State Line Church, we've had end-time event seminars for 23 months, every second Sabbath. And we have about 80 to 100 people come from all over the Northwest, Idaho, Oregon, Washington, to this. And we showed it there. And we showed the first part, and then we showed the second. And 2 weeks ago, we showed the third part. Today, you'll get to see 1 and 2. But we showed the third part, and I'll tell you, afterward, the audience was stunned. I mean, people couldn't even, they hardly would even stand up. They said, we didn't realize. This is incredible. They couldn't even. And Pastor Mike Lambert called me, and he said, at prayer meeting, that's all people talked about Wednesday night. They said, we never saw anything like that in our whole life. It inspired them to get out and do something. Take the great controversies and go out and do whatever we can do. And so that's what we're hoping, is we can inspire people. This isn't about us.
Nope.
But we tried to answer 2 questions.
3
questions, and you'll find that in the film this afternoon. But thanks for sharing that with us, Mike.
Yep.
And I just, I really appreciate working with Mike and Hector. I'm sorry Hector couldn't be here. He's booked up for 2 years in advance every Sabbath. But he's one of these guys, Hector Torres. You know him? When you travel with him, he's like a mouse. He doesn't say anything. When he says something, you better listen, because it's going to be good. And he shared about his father in communist Cuba, and he shared experiences and miracles. But usually he's just all ears. He's just all ears. And when he gets up in the pulpit, he turns into a different person. I mean, it's like he's on fire. You can almost see the flames over his head, you know. And so we just had a wonderful time. And we got back, and about 2 weeks later, he sent me an email. And he said, I just wanted to let you know that if there's anything I said or did that offended you, please forgive me. I can do. What could he say? But I mean, he's just so humble and so loving, and it was really amazing. You'll enjoy some of his comments in the film this afternoon. So the Waldenses, I believe, are a remnant church, and they're a model for us. They had a publishing work. They had literature evangelism. They had their own church school system. They had pastors, evangelists, literature evangelists, and missionaries. They were medical missionaries. Only recently we have realized that they were true medical missionaries. Ellen White said the pastors not only preached the gospel, but they what? Visited the sick. So I did a little research because I'm interested in medical work. And I have a lot of books in the Waldenses published in the 1800s, 1800s. Samuel Moreland is one of the most recognized historians on the Waldenses, and he said the greatest part of them, that's the pastors, the barbs, the greatest part of them gave themselves to the study and the practice of physic and chirurgery. This is the exact spelling from the book. And herein they excelled, thereby rendering themselves most able and skillful physicians both of soul and body. In Spanish, the operating room is called the quirófano. And so this chirurgery, surgery, that comes from Latin, and that's what the surgeons. They were actually physicians and surgeons. Here's another one, History of the Waldenses, Florence. It says, they had much experience in medicine and surgery, and these arts possess amazing secrets, wonderful in their simplicity. Here's another one. Each of those bars, besides knowledge and practice of ministry, had the knowledge of some trade, and especially medicine and surgery, for which they were skillful and well considered and practiced to charitably assist their needy brethren, as well as to cover them and help for the expenses of their long and dangerous journeys. Here's Sophia Bompiani. She said, every barb learned some manual trade or profession. The greater number were physicians or surgeons. How many? Most of them. But many were artisans, and all knew how to cultivate the fields and care for the flocks and herds. Before the invention of printing, they copied large portions of scriptures for use in their scholars, to whom they also taught the languages and instructed them in piety and good works. They visited the sick, whether called or not. They didn't charge people for seeing them. They didn't send them a bill, you know. Now, this is one of the most amazing quotations that I've ever seen from Ellen White. You know, we talk about the first coming of Jesus, and they talk about the second coming. Check this out. In their lonely retreats, they often met their Redeemer and conversed with him, as did the 2 disciples on the way to Emmaus. He would there open to them the sublime truths of his word and strengthen them in their determination not to put confidence in false guides, but to obey and worship him only who made and governed the world. Thus their words of faith cheered themselves and others, and their trials and perplexities only drove them nearer to God. But Jesus met them personally. You know, Jesus appeared to John the Revelator, right? He appeared to Saul, on the way to Damascus. So it isn't like just the first and second coming. He's come. In the Old Testament, he came to Abraham. He came to Daniel. Different ones. So this is an amazing quotation that maybe God can even in the last days, if not himself, he will send his angels to take care of us, right? Our bread and water will be sure. Take-home message. The Waldenses engaged in a complete ministry, a ministry for the whole man, body, mind, and soul. They are the true apostolic succession. So medical missionary work is woven into each succeeding section of God's true church today. Seventh-day Adventists are to emphasize this work. It is destined to play a key role in the closing acts of the great drama of eternity. God designs that the medical missionary work shall prepare the way for the presentation of the saving truths for this time, the proclamation of the third angel's message. All this design is met. The message will not be eclipsed. If this design is met, the message will not be eclipsed nor its progress hindered. Christ brought medical missionary work into his ministry. Cannot our eyes be open to discern Christ's methods? Cannot we understand the commission he gave to his disciples and to us? And there's another quotation which I didn't put on there. She said that the time is soon coming when our ministers will only be doing medical missionary work. They won't be doing anything else except medical missionary work. Our ministers. And we need to have a blended ministry with the church and our pastors all working together. So the appeal is, may God help us to follow the example of the Waldenses, not the way they are today. They've caved in to pressure. I mean, a lot of the pastors we saw over there, their eyes are bloodshot from alcohol. Their breath is strong with tobacco. I mean, I'm not saying this to be critical, but I mean, they've lost the vision. The light is no longer shining in darkness. That's their motto. Light shining in dark. It's not happening anymore. But it's starting to happen, as you'll find out later. Are you ready for the unfolding events? If you should be called in front of government or Protestant or Catholic leaders, would you be able to convincingly give the Bible passages supporting each of our distinctive beliefs and the three angels' messages? May God help us to dedicate ourselves 100% to being more like Jesus, to pray and study our Bibles like never before, and claim the promise, I will never leave thee nor forsake thee, so that we may boldly say, the Lord is my helper, and I will not fear what man shall do unto me. This is their logo, light shining in darkness. This is Pastor Esteban Janabel. He recently last year attended a tour given by our Adventist tour guide. And after they were having a vegan dinner there together afterward, he said, just blurted out. He says, did you know that most of the Waldenses all kept the seventh-day Sabbath? He says, I've been doing research. And he says, I have a group of 20 or 30 people, and we're all worshiping on Sabbath. He said, and Danielle just about fell out of her chair. She said, what did you say? He says, yeah. He says, and he graduated from a Baptist seminary down in Uruguay, in South America, where they have a lot of Waldenses that fled down there. And he's a trained theologian in the Waldenses, in history. He gives tours all over Europe. And he is now worshiping on Sabbath. And he was here. We did last month, we did a interview with Steve Wohlberg. We did another interview on Blue Mountain TV. He preached his first sermon in an Adventist church, in the State Line Church. First time ever that a Seventh-day Adventist church hosted in North America, hosted a Waldensian Sabbath-keeping pastor. And somebody says, are you going to, Roger Johnson in the interview on Blue Mountain Television, he said, well, are you going to be an Adventist? And he said, well, I get that question asked a lot, but he says, don't you have enough Adventists already? He says, if I say I'm an Adventist, they'll slam every door in my face. I will never be able to witness to any more Waldenses. But if he believes exactly like he's all read The Great Controversy, Steps to Christ, he's reading the book Maranatha, he believes exactly like we do. And so, my opinion is that he doesn't necessarily have to do this. I said, do you baptize people? Yeah, he says, we baptize by immersion, like the Bible says. He said, recently a lady came and said, I want to be baptized. And he said, I tested her and she knows all the doctrines. And guess what the follow-up is? 2 weeks ago, this lady, after she was baptized by Pastor Janaville, went back to her another place in Italy, and all of her Waldenses shunned her, wanted anything more to do with her. So she came back to Torre Pellice, and she's now staying with Danielle at the Adventist headquarters, and she said, I want to become a member of the Seventh-day Adventist Church. And Janaville, Pastor Janaville, he's okay with that. In fact, he comes to our church, and some of our members go to his church on Sabbath. So this is some exciting things that are happening, and I just... here he is at one of the monuments, and that's Danielle. You'll see her in the film. She's our worker over there, Bible worker. It says, our hearts ascend to God in prayer, that the precious light of present truth might reach the descendants of this long persecuted people. We firmly believe that God will open the way, that he will remove the obstructions which now shut the light from them. We feel confident, however, that the Lord will again work for this people and restore to those who will come to the light their former purity and fidelity to his service. The clear light of the third angel's message will yet be reflected from the honest-hearted in these valleys. The light in them which has grown dim will be brightened. The angel that joins the third angel is to lighten the earth with his glory. There will be many, even in these valleys, where the work seems to start with such difficulty, who will recognize the voice of God speaking to them through his word, and coming out from under the influence of the clergy will take their stand for God and the truth. This field is not an easy one in which to labor, nor is it one which will show immediate results, but there will be an honest people here who will obey in time. And it says, knowledge will be increased, faith and courage will revive, the truth will shine. The old battlefield will yet be the scene of victories now unseen, and the adoption of the Bible truth will vindicate the past fidelity of their fathers. So it's really exciting to see all this prophecies coming to pass. And I just hope that we will be inspired by these people. Read that chapter 4 in Great Controversy. You can go to the ABC and get the book, The Waldenses by Wiley. It's just small. It's chapter 16. And I think you'll be inspired that in the last days that we will have the same kind of courage and faith that they do. So thank you for allowing us to present this morning, and we look forward to seeing you this afternoon at 2 o'clock. I think we're going to have a closing song now.